It is the 6th of May 1946. In the Romanian capital of Bucharest, the People's Court is putting the man who led the country to defeat during World War II on trial. Having allied with Nazi Germany, the man led Romania to war and became zealous participants in the Holocaust. As with the main trial of the Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg, there are 24 men in the dock. However, these proceedings are much shorter, lasting only 12 days, as the result is a foregone conclusion. On the 17th of May 1946, the men's sentences are handed down, and shortly afterwards, the wartime leader of Romania is executed by firing squad. The man's name? Ion Antonescu, Romania's fascist dictator. The man known to history as Ion Antonescu was born on the 2nd of June 1882 in the town of Pitești in the Kingdom of Romania, about 100 kilometers northwest of the capital of the country, Bucharest. This date is according to the old Julian calendar that was still in use in Romania and a few other European countries at the time. The date corresponds to the 14th of June according to the Gregorian calendar that Romania only adopted belatedly in 1919. His father was Ion Antonescu Sr. He was a military officer who fought in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 and subsequently developed a wish for Ion Jr. to follow in his footsteps. Ion's mother was Chiriacita Dobrian. Other than Ion, the marriage resulted in one other child, a daughter. The details of Ion's early life are limited. This was an era when government record-keeping was still extremely limited in many parts of the Balkans and Eastern Europe. The idea of civil registration, whereby births, marriages and deaths were recorded with the state, was still only being introduced to parts of the Eastern Balkans around Romania as late as the 1890s. Furthermore, Ion was reluctant to talk about his youth in later years. When he was a young man, his father left his mother and divorced her. He soon married again to a Jewish woman named Frida Kupperman. Romania in those days had a large Jewish community, one which was at the forefront of the burgeoning Zionist movement in the second half of the 19th century. Ion blamed Mrs. Kupperman for the manner in which his family life was disrupted in his youth, and this contributed to his virulent anti-Semitism in later years. His relationship with his father was distant throughout his life as a result of the split in the family, though he was very close to his mother. Years later, he appears to have had evidence of the family split excised from any government records. Despite his troubled relationship with his father, Ion did follow in his footsteps from a young age. In 1898, he was sent to the military academy in the city of Craiova, a training school for sons of military officers. He excelled there, winning awards as the best student in his year in successive years. When he graduated in 1902, he was sent onwards to the Army School of Infantry and Cavalry in the capital, Bucharest. Another exceptional performance there led to him acquiring the rank of second lieutenant on graduation. Then he concluded his military training at a special cavalry school in Târgovista. Ion grew up at the same time as the modern Romanian state was first emerging. He was born just a few years after Romania acquired its independence. For centuries, this part of the Eastern Balkans had been divided into three major regions. These were Transylvania in the west, Wallachia in the south, and Moldavia in the north. Additional regions like Bessarabia, Transnistria and Bukovina were also considered part of historic Romania by many Romanian nationalists. Transylvania in the west had often been ruled by Hungary and had been reclaimed by the Austrian Empire in the 18th century, which subsequently became the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1867. At the same time, Russia had been extending its power southwestwards into Bessarabia and towards Moldavia. Wallachia and much of Moldavia remained under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, which had dominated the Balkans since the 16th century. The Ottoman Turks were in decline though, and in 1877 a fresh war between Russia and the Ottomans allowed Romania's buoyant nationalist movement to assert itself. At the end of the Russo-Turkish War in 1878, Romania emerged as an independent state. 3 years later, a year before Antonescu's birth, the Kingdom of Romania was established when King Carol I, a German prince, was crowned as the independent nation's first ruler. This new Kingdom of Romania did not cover the same lands as modern Romania. While it held most of Wallachia and Moldavia, Transylvania remained under the rule of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Transylvania itself was inhabited by a mix of people of Romanian, Germanic, and Hungarian heritage. Many Romanian nationalists clung to the idea of reconstituting Romania as a country similar to the province of Roman Dacia nearly 2,000 years earlier, a province which had included Transylvania. Others viewed Bessarabia, Bukovina, Transnistria, and parts of southwestern Ukraine as parts of historic Romania as well. This Romanian nationalism would shape Romanian politics for nearly a century. Antonescu would be deeply involved in efforts to expand the Romanian state. Back in the mid-1900s, after he finished his apprenticeship in various military academies, Lieutenant Antonescu was almost immediately plunged into active combat. This was an internal revolt within Romania. The Balkans and Eastern Europe remained very underdeveloped socially and economically into the modern era by comparison with Western and Central Europe. Back in the 1860s, prior to acquiring independence, some land reforms had been attempted in the Romanian provinces to drag the land system out of the Middle Ages and into the modern era. These efforts at land reform continued under an independent Romanian government, yet they only met with limited success. With the dawn of the 20th century, approximately 80% of the Romanian population still consisted of peasants eking out a living on small plots of land. Most of the land was controlled by large landowners. In the early spring of 1907, this situation exploded into violence around Romania as peasants revolted against the highly unequal land system. When the Peasants' Revolt of 1907 broke out, Antonescu was appointed as a cavalry commander in the Coverlui region around the modern-day border between Romania and Moldova. By all accounts, he won some admirers for the manner in which he managed to quell the violence in his region through tact and negotiations. King Carol sent his nephew and heir, Prince Ferdinand, to congratulate him in person after the fighting ended. Meanwhile, the Romanian government crushed the wider peasants' revolt violently. Thousands of peasants were killed. Afterwards, the government attempted some limited land reforms to try and prevent future unrest. His performance during the Peasants' Revolt and his stellar time as a trainee officer prior to this put Antonescu on the path to rapid promotion. In May 1908, he was made a first lieutenant and given command of a cavalry brigade. 3 years later, he was sent to the Advanced School of War, the Școala Superioară de Război, in Bucharest. The appointment was important. Romania was trying to modernize its army at a time when Western European armies were already trying to incorporate airplanes and submarines into their militaries, and Romania needed to catch up in all technical areas. While he was studying in Bucharest, the Balkans erupted into war. The Ottoman Empire was in terminal decline by the dawn of the 20th century. It had lost a vast part of its territory in the Balkans, though it still clung to a strip of land running through the south of modern-day Bulgaria and west through Macedonia and Kosovo to Albania. In October 1912, Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro and Greece formed the League of the Balkans and went to war with the Ottomans. They won a complete victory in the spring of 1913, and the Ottomans were stripped of over 80% of their remaining lands in the Balkans. Albania emerged as a new independent nation, while the other powers divided up the territory between them. This peace agreement soon led to the Second Balkan War, after Bulgaria went to war with its former allies in the summer of 1913. This occurred because the Bulgarians believed that they had been shortchanged in the peace terms. The Romanian government had stayed out of the First Balkan War. Now it sensed the possibility of acquiring land from Bulgaria and joined Greece, Serbia, the Ottomans and Montenegrins. In a swift war that lasted just 6 weeks, Bulgaria was completely defeated. Antonescu served as a chief staff officer during the conflict. Romania acquired the Dobruja region from Bulgaria through the Treaty of Bucharest. The Second Balkan War was followed within less than a year by the outbreak of the First World War. Despite all of the tensions which existed between the great powers like Britain, France and Germany over colonial rivalry in Africa and their respective industrial and military might, it was once again the politics of the Balkans which led to the outbreak of the global conflict in the summer of 1914. Serb nationalists assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, on a visit to Sarajevo, and this led to an escalation of tensions between the Russians and the Austrians after the government in Vienna sought to encroach on Serbia's sovereignty in response to the assassination. In the final days of July and the first days of August 1914, Europe marched to war as one country after another declared war on each other. The Entente powers of Britain, France, Russia and Serbia were pitted against the Central powers of Germany, the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottoman Empire. Italy joined the Entente in 1915, the same year Bulgaria joined the Central powers. Romania remained neutral for the first 2 years of the war, although Ferdinand I, who succeeded as King of Romania in the early stages of the war, was clearly sympathetic to the British cause, as his wife, Queen Marie, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and first cousin to King George V of Britain. Her views were a significant factor in the decision by the Romanian government to finally enter the war on the side of the British, French and Russians in August 1916. There were also clear strategic reasons. The Romanians aimed to acquire Transylvania from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The timing of their entry into the war was opportunistic, as the Russians had won a series of spectacular victories against the Austro-Hungarians through the Brusilov offensive in the summer of 1916. When Romania entered the war, Antonescu was after acquiring a position as the Chief of Staff to General Constantine Peasant, a figure who had emerged as one of the country's leading commanders during the Second Balkan War. Peasant was effectively made the head of the Romanian army in December 1916, and Antonescu rose alongside him, acquiring the title of Major within the army hierarchy. Romania's entry into the war was otherwise disastrous for all involved. The Russian war effort began to collapse in late 1916, and the Romanians found themselves isolated in the Balkans, facing the Austrians, Hungarians, Bulgarians and Turks. By the summer of 1917, Antonescu and the other Romanian commanders were fighting to stop their country from being overrun. The Romanian royal family fled from Bucharest and took refuge in the north of the country. Antonescu played an important role in the Battle of Marașești in August and September 1917, which prevented the Central Powers from advancing into the Moldavia region. Regardless of this defensive success, the Romanians were forced to negotiate a ceasefire in December 1917. Through the Treaty of Bucharest in May 1918, Romania was forced to cede Dobruja back to Bulgaria. For Romania, it was a bad end to the war, which it had hoped to benefit from entering, but things turned around as Britain, France and the United States won the war in Western Europe the following autumn and early winter. Romania re-entered the conflict in its dying days. Then, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed into a patchwork of different countries, Romania invaded Transylvania and parts of Hungary. Perceiving that they could now conquer the territory they had entered the war to begin with in 1916 in order to acquire. Antonescu was involved in these military campaigns, commanding a cavalry unit and playing other roles. The Hungarian-Romanian War that followed immediately after the First World War was a great success for Romania. It culminated in the Treaty of Trianon, a peace agreement between the victorious powers in the First World War and the new Hungarian state. Through this, Romania acquired Transylvania. Romania had also acquired Bukovina and joined it to the Romanian kingdom in the weeks after the First World War ended, while the Treaty of Bucharest in 1918 was annulled and Dobruja was returned to Romania by defeated Bulgaria under the terms of the Treaty of Neuilly in 1919. Antonescu played a role in this highly successful Romanian diplomacy at the Paris Peace Conference, penning an influential essay that argued the case for a greater Romania that bolstered public opinion for the cause at home in Romania. Theoretically, Romanians should have had little to complain about following the war. They had acquired extensive territory and built a greater Romania. And yet the country's politics would be extremely chaotic and unstable over the next 20 years. Extremist parties were emerging throughout the 1920s, notably the Iron Guard, founded in 1927 by Corneliu Codreanu. There were also tensions between agrarian and labor movements and more right-wing nationalist entities. This was fueled by Romania's close proximity to the newly communist USSR. A further destabilizing factor was the monarchy. Prince Karel had been disbarred from succeeding King Ferdinand as ruler of the country on account of his marriage to a commoner, and instead Karel's son, Michael, succeeded in 1927 on the death of Ferdinand. Karel returned from exile in 1930 and overthrew his own son. Thus, although Romania emerged as one of the major winners from the First World War, the country's politics over the 2 decades that followed was anything but stable. It was in this environment that Antonescu managed to rise to a position of some power in the country. As we will see shortly, Antonescu's political ascent during the interwar era was pivotal in his rise to power during the Second World War. But his personal experiences were nearly as consequential in the 1920s. Like his childhood experiences, his movements and personal conduct in the 1920s were later covered up, and historians have had to piece these together based on personal accounts from those who knew him during these years and fragmentary evidence. During the Paris peace talks in 1919 and 1920, Antonescu had been recommended to take the place of Romanian military attaché to the French government. His appointment was blocked on this occasion, though he was subsequently given the post in 1922. He spent most of the mid-1920s in Western Europe as a result, living in Paris and also visiting Brussels and London. During this time, he began a relationship with a French woman who had some Jewish heritage. He ended up marrying her, and she gave birth not long afterwards to his only child, a boy. The marriage did not last long. While he was in Paris, back in Romania, his future second wife, Maria Niculescu, had married a French Jewish man named Guillaume Fuller. They then moved to Guillaume's homeland, where Ion and Maria met in Paris. They began an affair, and before long the pair divorced their respective Jewish spouses and married each other. It was a peculiar episode. Antonescu would emerge as one of the most anti-Semitic leaders in Europe during the Second World War. This has been partly attributed to his father's abandonment of his family to marry a Jewish woman during his childhood years, but his own marriage to a French Jewish woman in the mid-1920s complicates the picture of his anti-Semitism. There was another personal development during these years which shaped Antonescu's life, career, and behavior. At some point, perhaps prior to or during the war, or maybe afterwards in Paris, he contracted syphilis, a bacterial infection generally spread as a sexually transmitted disease. It is easily treatable with antibiotics today, but in the early 20th century, there was no effective treatment, as Alexander Fleming had not yet identified penicillin as an antibacterial medicine, and it would not be widely deployed to treat syphilis until the 1940s. The illness causes fevers and rash in the short term. The more severe cases of it, known as tertiary syphilis, attack the body in many ways over a period of years and even decades. It leads to cardiovascular problems, cognitive decline, and many other issues. Antonescu is widely understood to have been a long-term sufferer from syphilis. From the 1920s onwards, there were recorded instances of him having violent mood swings which were symptomatic of the condition. One contemporary noted that he could begin a meeting in one frame of mind and was, quote, capable of turning into a completely different person without any warning. Many years later, during the Second World War, the German intelligence services even compiled a report on Antonescu's syphilitic condition. They noted that the illness was extremely common amongst Romanian cavalry officers. It went on to note that Antonescu was known to suffer from severe attacks every couple of months on account of his syphilis. Clearly, the Germans were concerned that this made him a potentially unreliable ally in the Balkans. It certainly needs to be borne in mind when evaluating Antonescu's behavior over the years. Antonescu's time in Paris in the mid-1920s enabled him to begin forging a political career parallel to his military one. France was Romania's closest ally during the interwar period, and Antonescu was involved in negotiations to supply the Balkan nation with the latest French military hardware. He also forged a number of important relationships during these years. The most significant was with Mihai Antonescu, who was not a relative despite their common surname. Mihai was an up-and-coming Romanian lawyer who would soon establish himself with the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Romania, ties Ion would exploit in years to come. Mihai would benefit from Ion's rise in due course. When he returned to Romania with his second wife in 1926, Ion began operating a dual career as a military officer and an aspiring politician. He continued as a staff training officer, for instance, in Bucharest, while at the same time he acquired a post in 1928 as the Secretary General within the Ministry of Defense. This was a middling position, but it meant he was now moving within government circles in the capital and was able to begin forging more political alliances. At the same time, his political outlook and ideology was evolving. Antonescu was a staunch Romanian nationalist. This was hardly unusual at the time. Despite the manner in which nationalist zeal had led to the devastation of the First World War, most people left that war with an even more zealous nationalist outlook. On the domestic front, he was anti-Semitic and anti-Ziganist, a term used to describe those who expressed racial hatred for the Romani people of the Balkans. Socially, he leaned towards extreme conservatism, favoring the monarchy, rejecting any form of socialism, and leaning towards enforcing conservative social standards. Many years later, when he rose to power, Antonescu would begin introducing legislation which imposed guidelines around how men and women should dress and even use of bicycles. Antonescu's anti-communist and pro-conservative stance was often in favor in Romania as the country entered the 1930s. On other occasions, it was not. The country's politics was chaotic after the Great Depression began late in 1929. As industrial activity collapsed and economic stagnation set in, there were over a dozen governments formed in less than 10 years. Overshadowing this was a royal coup. In the summer of 1930, Prince Karel, a member of the royal family who had been forced to relinquish his position in the succession in 1927 in favor of his own 5-year-old son, Michael, returned from exile, deposed his son, and ascended as King Karel II. Additionally, extremist groups like the National Christian Party and the Legion of Archangel Michael, better known as the Iron Guard, were established and became major players in the growing fascist politics of the country. Antonescu had ties to both groups. In late 1937, when Octavian Goga, a leader of the National Christian Party, was appointed as Prime Minister, Antonescu was given the position of Minister for Defense within the administration. He was also on good terms with Corneliu Zela Codreanu, the head of the Iron Guard. The latter relationship cut Antonescu's time as Minister for Defense short in 1938, when Codreanu was placed on trial, imprisoned and executed for his antagonistic attitude towards King Karel II. This could have scuppered Antonescu's career, but in reality, the king and his advisors were facing a growing wave of opposition to his style of rule and policies. Antonescu would soon be able to take advantage of this alongside the Iron Guard and other extremists. Antonescu's political career might have largely been at an end, and he would be just a footnote in European history had it not been for events beyond Romania's borders in the late 1930s. It was not just Romania that had been experiencing chaotic politics in the years after the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed it. This had brought fascist and corporatist governments to power in nearly every country in Central Europe, while even those in Poland and Czechoslovakia had military authoritarian streaks to them. The Nazis under Adolf Hitler in Germany were the most aggressive of these, and in March 1938, as they continued their drive to remilitarize and renew Germany as a great power, they annexed Austria into a Greater Germany. Next, the Nazis turned their focus to Czechoslovakia, which was dismembered in 2 phases between September 1938 and March 1939. In Romania, the government viewed these events skeptically. They were inclined to maintain their alliance with the British and French, which meant opposition to Germany. At the same time, they were wary that Miklos Horthy, the long-standing semi-dictator of Hungary, was drawing closer to Hitler. When the Second World War finally broke out in September 1939, after the Germans invaded Poland, it opened the possibility that a newly aggressive Hungary could enter the war and seek to reacquire Transylvania from Romania. As such, there were tensions in Bucharest during this time. Surprisingly though, it was not Hungary that struck the first blow against Romania. Instead, in late June 1940, while Europe was reeling from Germany's rapid conquest of Denmark, Norway, France, Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands in the space of less than 3 months, the Soviet Union occupied Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. As a relatively minor power, Romania was in no position to oppose this naked act of aggression by the Russians. There was a response to all of this from within Romania. Many military and political figures, like Antonescu, were deeply unhappy with what had occurred. They perceived that King Karel II and his advisors had foolishly decided to maintain close relations with France and Britain, even as Germany surged to become the dominant power of the continent. This had fatally compromised Romania, which had been unable to prevent the Soviet annexation of its territory because it was isolated and without allies. Antonescu personally complained to King Karel and was imprisoned briefly in response. The incident demonstrated the weakness of the government, which now felt as though it had to arrest opponents who were expressing opposition to very real problems. Antonescu was soon released, just in time to witness a further humiliation for Romania. On the 30th of August 1940, just 2 months after the Soviets had claimed Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, Hitler's government adjudicated over an agreement known as the Second Vienna Award in the capital of Austria. Through this, Romania was stripped of a large chunk of Transylvania that was given to Hungary, the argument being that Hungary had unfairly lost this as a result of the Romanian invasion of its lands in 1919. This was nothing more than the law of the jungle. The Hungarians had allied closely with the Germans and were in a position to claim Transylvania while Romania was weak in the late summer of 1940. In Bucharest and other parts of what remained of Romania, people like Antonescu watched on with severe apprehension. They had now lost territory in the north and west and rest of their country. Next, what remained of Romania might be completely divided up between its neighbors, just as Czechoslovakia had been gradually dismembered in 1938 and 1939. The Second Vienna Award was the spur to action that Antonescu and many others within Romania needed. The government had already started to take steps to address the situation after the Soviet incursion, appointing a new government headed by a military commander, Ion Antonescu, and withdrawing from the League of Nations. Efforts to draw closer to Germany failed to prevent the Second Vienna Award, and Antonescu and King Karel were fatally undermined by this. In desperation, the king turned to Antonescu to acquire his support in stabilizing the political situation. Antonescu had other ideas. He now moved to form an alliance with the ultra-nationalist and fascist Iron Guards. Their leader by 1940, Horia Sima, had served briefly in several governments, and he and Antonescu were well acquainted with one another. In the days following the Second Vienna Award, they allied together to launch a coup to overthrow the king and his advisors. It was a bloodless revolt. On the 4th of September 1940, it was made clear to Karel that he no longer had the support of any major political group in the country. Pressure was also being applied by the Germans. Thus, on the 5th of September, Karel agreed to abdicate. He renounced his throne the following day. Antonescu had assumed the office of Prime Minister on the 5th, while Sima would become Vice President of the Council of Ministers in mid-September, effectively bringing the Iron Guard into government as well. To maintain the facade of continuity, Karel's son, King Michael I, who had been deposed by his own father back in 1930, was reinstated as the King of Romania. But to all intents and purposes, Antonescu had now become the fascist ruler of Romania, with Sima as his second in command. Antonescu's powers derived from the position he appointed himself to after the coup. This was the office of Conducător, or leader, the Romanian equivalent of Führer in German, or Il Duce in Italian. This position came with similar powers, although Antonescu was facing two immediate major difficulties. First, within days, he had to agree to the Treaty of Craiova, through which another Axis power, Bulgaria, reacquired the southern end of the Dobruja region that Romania had acquired all the way back in 1913 at the end of the Second Balkan War. Secondly, he had a fiscal crisis to deal with, as King Karel and his allies had left the country with a huge proportion of the Romanian treasury, which they embezzled and took with them. To cement his control in the face of these early issues, Antonescu relied heavily on the brute force offered by the Iron Guards. He then did what all fascist leaders around Europe had done over the course of the 1930s. He began crushing any other opposition and took over the social, legal, and political institutions of the state, like the media and the courts. The issue for Antonescu, though, was that he, like Hitler with Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA back in 1934, had a rival for power, Within weeks, the relationship between him and Horia Sima was fraying. Concerned that Sima and his Iron Guards would move to oust him before long, Antonescu began undermining their position in the late autumn and winter of 1940. Tensions came to a head over the murder of a German agent in Bucharest in January 1941. Sima launched a revolt known as the Legionnaires' Rebellion. Antonescu only just managed to keep the situation contained in Bucharest for long enough to mobilize the army to break the revolt on the 22nd and 23rd of January 1941. Sima fled to Germany and was allowed to go from there into exile in Spain. Antonescu was now securely in control of Romania without a rival for power. The Legionnaires' revolt occurred as Antonescu was preparing for Romania to play a more active role in the Second World War, as Hitler began preparing to invade the Soviet Union. After conquering France and the Low Countries in the summer of 1940, the Nazis had turned their attention to try to coerce Britain into surrendering or negotiating peace terms through a naval blockade and a campaign of aerial bombardment of Britain. This failed in the face of concerted British resistance, and Hitler soon turned his attention instead to the great ideological enemy of Germany, the Soviet Union. Antonescu hoped to benefit from war with the Soviets and Romania playing a considerable role therein. Romania's war aims formed part of its wider national strategy going all the way back to Antonescu's earliest years. While the Russian Empire had helped Romania acquire its independence through the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, Russia had taken lands in Bessarabia and Moldavia, which many Romanians considered to be part of their ancestral homeland. While some of these were reacquired in the chaos of the Russian Civil War, as we have seen, Stalin had seized them again in the summer of 1940. The Romanians wanted to reclaim these again and to try and acquire all of Bukovina, as well as lands further to the east. Ultimately, Antonescu had designs on expanding Romania's presence towards the important port city of Odessa and hoped to win concessions from Hitler by playing an important role amongst the Axis powers in the invasion of the USSR. A rivalry between the Romanians and the Hungarians to curry favor with the Nazis was also in play here, as Antonescu would have hoped for a re-evaluation of the Second Vienna Award in the long term. Antonescu was in a strong position to try and achieve some of these Romanian war aims. This must be viewed within the context of Romania's petroleum industry. We do not associate Romania with the global oil trade today, although it remains a relatively important producer in European terms. However, it has been eclipsed by the giants of the world oil industry in the Middle East, Central Asia, and other countries like Russia, Norway, and Venezuela. Things were very different a century and a half ago. Romania was one of the first countries in the world that developed a petroleum industry. This began in 1857. As the demand for petroleum increased in the late 19th century, so too did Romania's extraction, and for a time it was one of the world's largest producers. What was more, because Romania was not an industrialized nation, it was able to export the vast majority of what it took out of the ground, in the same way which Norway exports nearly all of its oil today, as its domestic energy needs are met by hydroelectricity. What this meant is that when the Second World War broke out, Romania had an outsized importance in supplying oil to Germany to fuel its war machine. This role became greater over time as the war went on, and Germany was cut off from many of its alternative sources in the Soviet Union and overseas. The politics of oil, therefore, placed Antonescu in an advantageous position during the war. He was able to leverage Germany's reliance on Romanian oil to gain promises of land concessions from the Nazis in Bessarabia and Transnistria. He also aimed to revisit the Second Vienna Award, and Transylvania returned to Romania in the long term. This politics of oil would soon become an Achilles heel, though, for the Romanians, as the Allies eventually decided that Romania was a strategic target for aerial bombing in order to damage its wells and refineries. Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, began on the 22nd of June 1941. Romania would contribute more troops to the war on the Eastern Front than any of the other Axis powers other than Germany itself. The invasion was three-pronged, with one arm of the German Wehrmacht heading north towards Leningrad, one following a more northeasterly line towards Moscow, and a southern arm striking directly eastwards towards Kyiv, with the ultimate goal of securing the Caucasus oil fields. For obvious geographical reasons, the Romanians played the largest role in the southern arc. In July, they proceeded into Ukraine, and then in early August, they led the siege of the great Black Sea port city of Odessa. Over a 2-month-long siege, the Romanians fielded over 100,000 men against the Red Army. Although a German detachment under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was sent to aid the Romanians here, Antonescu's forces were the primary Axis army at the siege of Odessa. The Romanians' capture of the city in mid-October 1941 constituted the biggest victory won by one of the more minor Axis powers like Romania, Hungary and Bulgaria anywhere in Europe during the Second World War. Afterwards, the Romanians pushed on. They contributed to the building of bridges over the Dnieper River as central Ukraine was conquered in the autumn and winter of 1941, and then played a major role in the Battle of the Kerch Peninsula in the first half of 1942, one of the under-acknowledged battles of the Second World War. Meanwhile, there were some limited naval engagements between the Romanians and the Soviets in the Black Sea. As the Romanian involvement in the war grew, Antonescu met many times with the leadership of Nazi Germany. Between his rise to power in September 1940 and the summer of 1944, Antonescu traveled to Germany or Poland 10 different times to meet with Hitler and other senior political and military figures of the Third Reich. Despite the reservations that the German intelligence services had expressed about Antonescu's syphilitic condition and his sometimes erratic behavior, the Roman dictator developed a good relationship with Hitler. In the weeks prior to the commencement of the invasion of the Soviet Union, Antonescu met with him and was a vocal supporter of the initiative. He appealed to Hitler's racial prejudices by stating that the Russians were the preeminent Slavic people of Eastern Europe and that conquering them would be a great achievement for the civilized nations of Europe. He portrayed the Romanian people as being the successors to the Romans in the Balkans on account of the ancient province of Dacia having been colonized heavily in Roman times and Romanian being a Romance language derived from Latin. He then added that the Romanians were a civilized people surrounded in the Balkans by Slavic groups in much the same way that the Germans were attempting to overcome hostile Slavs in Eastern Europe. Strangely, Antonescu was willing to contradict Hitler during their regular conferences. This was something Hitler didn't often tolerate in his subordinates. He took it well from Antonescu, though, and the German dictator seems to have looked favorably on Antonescu's aggressive nationalism and willingness to throw Romania's support firmly behind Germany in order to benefit in the Balkans and Ukraine. Another reason why Antonescu found favor with Hitler might have been because of the eagerness with which he followed the racial policies of the Nazis. Even before the rise to power of Antonescu and the aligned far-right groups that supported him in Romania in the autumn of 1940, the country had experienced many years of growing racial extremism. The Iron Guard and other fascists and ultra-nationalist entities were anti-Semitic and also expressed deeply racial views on the Romani and Sinti. Like all Balkan nations, Romania was a country where racial extremism had emerged in the 19th century, and even groups like the Hungarians and Bulgarians who lived in Romanian lands were viewed as enemies of the state. In 1938, nearly 250,000 Jews within Romania had been deprived of citizenship through a law passed by the Goga administration in which Antonescu served as Minister for Defense. Pogroms were not unknown in the country as well prior to Antonescu's rise to power. The fascist regime of Antonescu would adopt a more genocidal policy though. The final solution was adopted by Nazi Germany in the second half of 1941. It was to be enacted all over Axis-controlled Europe. In reality though, many of the other Axis powers resisted efforts to impose the policy in their lands. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, was a deeply racist man, but he was not really anti-Semitic and had several Jewish lovers during his lifetime. The Holocaust was really only implemented in Italy after the Nazis took control over the north and central parts of the country in September 1943. Similarly, for all the extremism of Ortiz regime in Hungary, the majority of the deaths there occurred in a 6-month period in the spring, summer and autumn of 1944, after the Germans effectively took over racial policy within Hungary. The Romanian example was unusual in that Antonescu displayed no such reticence. They were eager contributors to the Holocaust. The Holocaust in Romania began within weeks of Antonescu seizing power. It was driven at this early stage by the Iron Guard. Gangs of their members roamed rural areas, attacking Jewish Romanians, and their lands were taken from them in some instances. This resulted in an exodus of Jewish people into the larger towns, and in particular into Bucharest. This mirrored developments elsewhere. The precursor to the final solution being implemented in the 6 Nazi death camps in Poland was the corralling of a significant proportion of the country's Jews into ghettos in Warsaw and Krakow. In Romania, this was more of an organic process as the country's Jewish people gathered in the capital for strength in numbers. Pogroms occurred there as early as January 1941 as part of the Legionnaires' Rebellion. In the course of 1941, Antonescu ordered a more thorough rounding up of the country's Jewish people into the cities and towns. Romanian troops engaged in the mass murder of Jewish inhabitants of Bukovina and parts of Ukraine at the same time as the war with the Soviet Union began. The fall of Odessa saw one of the largest pogroms of the war. The exact scale is unclear, but many estimates agree that at least 25,000 Jewish people were killed. Antonescu approved these actions. By 1942, the Romanian government was sending Jewish people to the death camps. Somewhere between 280,000 and 400,000 Jewish people were killed by Antonescu's regime. The vast majority of these were in lands Romania had claimed in the aftermath of the First World War, in places like Bukovina and parts of Transylvania, or in Ukraine. The regime was surprisingly less murderous in their other lands. Yet Antonescu was undoubtedly one of the foremost mass murderers of the Second World War. Tens of thousands of Romani and Sinti people were also killed by his regime. The Holocaust escalated across Europe even as the war effort turned drastically against those who were orchestrating it. The first steps in implementing the final solution were taken by the German government at a conference in the suburbs of Berlin in January 1942. This was 2 months after a series of events that had turned the war around completely. First, the Germans failed to conquer Moscow and Leningrad before the Russian winter set in and became bogged down in a war of attrition on the Eastern Front. Then Germany and Romania's ally, the Empire of Japan, attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The Japanese could never hope to defeat the Americans in an extended war, and the Soviet Union would eventually be able to bring its superior manpower to bear on the Germans in Europe. Faced with this scenario, Hitler gambled in 1942 on the idea of trying to secure the Caucasus oil fields in the hope that this would cripple the Red Army and win the war. The city of Stalingrad was the key to the Caucasus region. In the ensuing Battle of Stalingrad, fought between the late summer of 1942 and the late winter of 1943, the Romanians contributed approximately 200,000 men. A huge proportion of these were killed, captured, or incapacitated by the time the battle ended in a complete Soviet victory in the first days of February 1943. Soon the counter-offensive would begin all along the Eastern Front, and the Germans, Romanians, Hungarians, and other Axis armies would be pushed back westwards. In the midst of this turn of fortunes, Antonescu became ill. Historians have speculated on whether this was his syphilis acting up, or if he suffered a nervous breakdown of some kind, as the reality of impending defeat now dawned on him. By the second half of 1943, the Axis powers were on the defensive in the east. The Battle of Kursk in western Russia, the largest tank battle in history, broke the German position there in the late summer. Further south, the Germans and Romanians were being pushed back into Ukraine. Kyiv was liberated in December 1943 after a lengthy battle and counteroffensive. With this, the Romanian position became increasingly vulnerable. The Western Allies had invaded Italy, and German resources were being deployed there. Romania now lay close to the front line in Ukraine and would soon be facing the Red Army without any real possibility of major support from Germany. Conscious that defeat was imminent, Antonescu began trying to establish contact with the Western Allies in the hope of negotiating surrender terms. By late 1943, Romanian diplomats were active in neutral Switzerland, Sweden, and Portugal to establish surrender terms with the British and the Americans. Antonescu believed he was in a strong negotiating position, in part because he was able to argue that if he switched sides in the war, it would deprive Germany of the vital oil that it needed to keep its tanks and war factories operating. The Allies proved unreceptive, demanding an unconditional surrender. The Romanian dictator's position was not helped by King Michael. He was now a man in his early 20s and beginning to show an independent streak, whereas he was no more than a puppet ruler for the regime when Antonescu reinstalled him as king back in 1940. When addressing the nation on New Year's Day 1944, Michael indicated his disapproval of the continued involvement in the war. It was clear to the policymakers in London and Washington thereafter that a royal faction was developing in opposition to Antonescu in Romania, and they did not need to negotiate with Hitler's ally. In any event, by the spring of 1944, plans were in preparation for the Red Army to liberate the Balkans. The Soviets advanced towards Bessarabia in March 1944. Antonescu's resolve to keep fighting as part of the Axis powers was strengthened when Hitler promised that if he did so, Romania would be rewarded with the restoration of a large part of Transylvania that had been granted away to Hungary back in the summer of 1940 through the Second Vienna Award. Antonescu somehow managed to convince himself that an Axis victory was still possible. Perhaps if the alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union collapsed, and in the late spring a Romanian counter-offensive began. The Germans, meanwhile, drew up a plan for the takeover of Romania, along with Hungary and Bulgaria, if Antonescu attempted to surrender. A similar plan to what had happened in Italy in September 1943, when the Italian government began negotiating with the Allies. At the same time, the Allies were beginning extensive bombing missions against Bucharest and Romania's oil industry. As the Soviets began to break through the Romanian defenses in the summer, Antonescu's position had become untenable. His final visit to see Hitler in early August ended with a half-hearted promise to fight on. Just over 2 weeks later, as the Red Army broke into northern Romania, Antonescu was overthrown on the 23rd of August 1944. The man who led the coup was the king he had installed as a puppet ruler 4 years earlier. King Michael had the backing of several political groups, including the Romanian Communist Party, the Liberals, and the Peasants' Party. Antonescu was arrested after a meeting in which he informed the king of the deteriorating military situation. Within hours of the largely bloodless coup, a ceasefire was being agreed with the Red Army. and Romania swiftly moved from being one of Germany's staunchest allies to joining with Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union against the Nazis. Antonescu was soon handed over to the Romanian communists as the Red Army moved into the country, and the communists largely became the interim power in collaboration with King Michael. Meanwhile, the situation in Romania as a whole was changing rapidly. Overnight, after the coup of the 23rd of August, Romania had found itself at war with the Axis. The fighting consequently switched from the north against the Red Army to the west against Hungary. A combined Romanian and Red Army offensive was fought against the Hungarians and the German 8th Army in the Battle of Turda in September and early October 1944. The Axis offered staunch resistance, and this was not an easily won campaign. In the end, the Romanians and Soviets pushed the Axis westwards as the Nazis redeployed their troops and tried to shorten their lines. By early 1945, bands of the Romanian army would be moving westwards into Hungary, Slovakia, and other regions as more and more of Europe was liberated. The war came to an end in early May 1945. One of the terms of the new peace treaties agreed in Paris in 1946 and 1947 was that the Second Vienna Award of 1940 was voided and Transylvania was returned to Romania in line with the Treaty of Trianon of 1920. In the end, Romania had managed to reacquire the territory it lost in 1940 by joining the Allies, not by siding with the Axis powers as Antonescu had attempted. As the war was winding down, Ion Antonescu was being moved between different prisons. He was not treated poorly. Indeed, one of his places of detention was a large mansion on the outskirts of Bucharest. Oversight of Antonescu and other political prisoners was handed to Smersh, the counterintelligence umbrella organization that the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, had established during the war. Members of Smersh questioned Antonescu on numerous occasions regarding the nature of the alliance with Hitler and Romania's role in the Holocaust, the full extent of which was only becoming clear in the final months of the war as the concentration camps were liberated across Poland and other countries. For the most part, though, those in charge of Antonescu were simply waiting until the end of the war when a decision would be taken about war crimes tribunals in Romania. These trials have generally been overshadowed by those which involved the leaders of Germany at Nuremberg from late 1945 onwards. They were actually more extensive in some of the other Axis countries. Approximately 27,000 people, for instance, were convicted in Hungary, a far higher number than in Germany. Only a few hundred people were tried in Romania. Antonescu's regime had been limited in terms of its leadership, and some groups like the Iron Guard had already been purged back in 1941. Antonescu's trial was the most important in the post-war period. It commenced in May 1946, and he was charged with a range of crimes, including fomenting the war, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity, as well as treason against the Romanian state and people. The trial was not long and involved a litany of evidence of his crimes, events like his involvement in the pogroms in Odessa following the fall of the city in 1941. Antonescu was afforded the quite rare punishment to be executed by firing squad as a military commander. The Nazi leaders who were sentenced to death at Nuremberg were hanged, a much more dishonorable death. The execution was carried out on the 1st of June 1946. He was 63 years old at the time of his death. At the time of Antonescu's execution, the post-war political fate of his country was still undecided. The Soviets had led the liberation of the Balkans, along with communist partisans native to places like Romania and Yugoslavia. Still, a clear-cut communist regime had not been established immediately afterwards in late 1944. There was a transition process in which observers in places like Britain and Washington, D.C. hoped that a more democratic country might emerge. The monarchy even remained in place. Things were beginning to drift ominously, though, in 1945. King Michael was forced to accept the appointment of Petru Groza, a Soviet-backed official, as the interim prime minister of the country in March 1945. Once the war ended and the Cold War began to develop, the writing seemed on the wall for Romania. When Michael visited London in 1947 to celebrate the marriage of the future Queen Elizabeth II to Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, he was offered asylum there if he wished to not return to Romania. He rejected the offer, but within weeks of returning to Romania, he was deposed, and a more fully fledged authoritarian communist government was appointed. Michael was forced to leave the country in the first days of 1948, and Gheorghe Gheorghe emerged as the new leader of communist Romania. At first, the country was tightly controlled by Moscow and eventually became a member of the Soviet alliance in Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact. Later, though, it steered a more independent line. Yet Romania ultimately swapped fascist dictatorship under Antonescu during the war for communist dictatorship under Nicolae Ceausescu in the post-war era. He assumed power in 1965 and ruled Romania for nearly a quarter of a century before being overthrown in 1989 at the end of the Cold War. His time in power was marked by human rights abuses, persecution of minorities, and huge levels of official corruption. Hence, many of the issues which plagued Romania during Antonescu's lifetime continued into the Cold War, albeit now under communist rule rather than an ultra-nationalist government. Ion Antonescu is often overlooked in general histories of the Second World War. His role in it was greater than is often assumed. He began his life as the son of a Romanian military officer, a member of the relatively small middle class of Romanian society in the late 19th century. His family background was unstable. His father abandoned the family when he was a child and married a Jewish Romanian woman, a development which perhaps partially explains Antonescu's later anti-Semitism. Despite his differences with his father, Ion followed in his footsteps into a military career. He had an aptitude for becoming a military officer and excelled in military college. Then he was promoted rapidly as a result of his participation in the Peasants' Revolt of 1907, the Second Balkan War in 1913, and in the First World War, after Romania entered into it in 1916. This led to a political career in the 1920s, and by the 1930s, he was a leading figure in Romanian politics. His career seemed to be in peril in the late 1930s after he became involved in opposition to the monarchy, but the outbreak of the Second World War and Romania's loss of territory to the Soviet Union and Hungary in the summer of 1940 provided an opening for him to unseat King Karel II in a coup in September that year and seize power. As dictator of Romania, Antonescu threw the country's support strongly behind Nazi Germany. Romania contributed more troops than any Axis power other than the Germans themselves to the war against the Soviet Union. More significantly, Antonescu became an ardent participant in the Holocaust of Europe's Jewish people, while other minorities like the Romani and Sinti were persecuted and mass murdered as well. Antonescu's approach was different to other Axis leaders. While Mussolini in Italy and Horthy in Hungary were lukewarm supporters of the Holocaust in order to appease Hitler, Antonescu was firmly behind the genocidal policies of the Nazis. In the summer of 1944, as the war turned against him, he attempted to negotiate surrender terms, but he was overthrown and Romania was liberated before these attempts went anywhere. Imprisonment and trial followed, in many ways because so many of the Nazi leaders took their own lives as the war came to an end. Antonescu was one of the foremost individuals still alive to face a court for orchestrating the Holocaust. He was found guilty and executed for his crimes. No individual was more responsible for Romania's descent into violence in the 1940s than he was. What do you think of Ion Antonescu? Was he the main driving force behind the terrible crimes of the Romanian government during the Second World War, or was he possibly more of a symptom of the extremism which developed in the country in the interwar era? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.